If you were asked to provide a musical soundtrack to the Chapman Brothers exhibition, the last Radiohead LP, All Hail to the Thief, might just do the job, combining bittersweet melodies with harsh rhythms and juxtaposing lyrical images of childhood innocence with adult horror. The band share the Chapmans' darkly comic worldview. Now Radiohead's virtuoso guitarist Jonny Greenwood has been asked to provide a soundtrack of his own, not for an art exhibition, but an art film called Body Song. The film is a montage of images tracing the journey of life from cradle to grave, featuring scenes of childbirth, work, sex, war, religious worship and death. There's no dialogue. Instead, director Simon Pummel asked Jonny Greenwood to create a musical narrative to match the images compiled from the archives.
In a way, it was a dream assignment for me, because instead of having to, as in a normal film, leave room for dialogue and time everything to the last second and force players to play along with click tracks, and which is traditionally what you have to do. Instead, I just had to provide 3 or 4 minutes of music, and he'd cut the film to that. You know, he'd send me 20 minutes of footage of a certain style and say that he was going to edit it to 3 or 4 minutes and ask me to do some music. So I had a flavour, and I could just, you know, write music to that. And I'm sure a real film would be a lot more restrictive.
And did you have an idea of the sort of soundscape that you were going to create? Because that's the best way I can describe it. It is a kind of a musical journey as well, in a way. It's not a series of songs or even motifs.
Yeah, I mean, I was very conscious that it would be very boring to listen to a whole hour and a half of music in one style. But at the same time, if it was jumping style all the time, that can be quite exhausting as well. It's a long time to be listening to one piece of music. So the way I got around it is I wrote everything in the same scale, basically. So when I had the jazz musicians in, they were the only notes that they were allowed to play. And when I wrote the string stuff, I was restricting myself to these certain notes, a certain scale. That's how it's meant to tie together. And
so there's a kind of harmonic unity.
Exactly.
To the whole
there's
piece.
only certain chords you can get out of this mode, and there's only certain kind of colours, and that's what's tying it together, I hope.
Did that make it easier or harder?
I think it was good, because as soon as you have limits, then it's easier to start. You're looking for a way around things and ways of solving problems, rather than just being, you know, floating free, which I think I would find a lot more intimidating.
But I presume you're working in a very different way to the way you work with Radiohead. I mean, because you're not working with other people, you're working just within your own head and responding to those images. So these were ideas that wouldn't normally arrive in the band format then?
In a way, it felt like a continuation of a Radiohead session. You know, I was in the Radiohead studio using the Radiohead engineer and some of the techniques that we've learnt on our albums of building tape loops and certain kind of computer programming. And I was very much looking to the others for advice all the time and playing them the recordings. Tom even came up with some of the titles for me. So I wasn't in such isolation, and it would frighten me to be so alone, I think, working on music. You realise what's so important to be in a team. And
what about the process of recording? Because I presume when you're in the studio with the band, you're all playing together, laying down the basic track. But here, you're alone, and I know you are a multi-instrumentalist, but you were having to multi-track everything.
That's right. Occasionally it was quite comic. There's one track called Convergence where it sounds like a drum troupe all playing out of time, and slowly it all falls in time. But the way that it was done with lots of tape loops and just seemed to involve me sat on the floor like a child with one drum at a time, you know, playing this very simple thing over and over again.
That's you playing everything in that?
Yeah, but it sounds much larger, obviously.
Well, at the beginning of the track, it sounds like one of those primary school rhythm
right, exactly.
When everybody's given something to bang.
And I was right back there. Yeah, I felt very much like a primary school musician for that, you know, which I enjoyed.
But it does converge, as the title suggests, into this martial beat at the end, and then that music is cut to, I think, images of conflict, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that was done for the fighting scene, just because I couldn't think of how melodies and tunes could really tie that kind of footage together.
It's quite an organic album, isn't it? I mean, it's recorded. Most of the instruments are acoustic instruments, and you have a string quartet there.
Right.
At a time when Radiohead has, as a band, increasingly been exploring those electronic forms of music.
There are lots of computers involved manipulating sounds, but it's true that most of them started with microphones and instruments. And I just found that a revelation that you can, it sounds trite to say, but the fact that you can write melodies on paper and then hear a string quartet play them, and the leap in musicality and the personality of the performer and all of those variables can make it an enormous piece of music. Whereas I'm used to, if you write 4 notes on a computer and ask that computer to play a keyboard, then you will hear exactly what you've programmed, and there'll be no other input from anybody else or from the keyboard even.
Was it a learning process for you working with these, I suppose, classically trained musicians, in the same way that on that Radiohead Amnesiac album you worked with Humphrey Lyttelton Jazz Band?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there's so many sounds out there and so many instruments and combination of instruments. It's just a shame to ignore them and just go look at new technology. I started to look at all these instruments as being just technology from different eras. And I mean, there's one track on this record at the end that is a string quartet, but I'm also using this electronic instrument called a martineau, which is from the 20s, together with a vocoder, which is like 1960s technology. And then it struck me that, well, string quartet is technology as well from 500 years ago. But that kind of combination of things is what I'm most into at the moment, really.
When you are having to evoke a musical sense of what we're seeing on screen, and it is the passage of life from childbirth and there's conflict, there's sex in there, was it difficult to guard against what we now know to be musical cliches?
Yes, it was a problem, because as soon as you see footage of mass graves and such like, you can nearly hear the sliding strings and the atonal clusters, and the shots of the children, you can imagine music boxes, and there are certain standards that you want to avoid. But then when you have lyrical things happening, you can't avoid the cliches for the sake of it, and strings are beautiful, and there's nothing richer and warmer than the sound of them playing. So yeah, it is a balance. It's interesting.
Frantic bebop jazz during the sex scenes.
Yes, I mean, it was kind of vaguely sort of farcical and comical, and I just thought that was the sound of it, really. I'm not sure why. I don't want to think about that too closely.
Radiohead's Jonny Greenwood. His music for the film Body Song is released on the Parlophone label next week, and the film is due for release later this year.